C3, Connecting Coaches Cognition, Coaching with Courtney and Christensen. As a busy coach, you spend all day refueling, revamping, and reflecting with educators. Now's the time to stop and recharge your batteries with some much-needed coaching for the coach.
Welcome back to another episode of C3. I'm Courtney Groskin, and I'm here with
Violet Christensen.
Violet, what's new in your world?
Oh, we're just in that go, go, go phase. And it's just that time of the year where you're just trying to wrangle that to-do list and just trying to make sure that you're hitting all of the points and really making every moment count in education, which I think is every season, but it just hits us at this moment even harder. And so I'm just enjoying collaborating with teachers and just being able to have some of those calibrating conversations about expectations and personally just trying to manage all of the activities between my daughters and balance work and home and all of their things that they're diving into. And so that's always many plates and just trying to make sure all the plates can balance together, right?
Totally. It's juggling plates.
Juggling plates is a good way to put it. And some days it goes so smoothly and you're like, oh my gosh, we got out the door. We have extra time. What is going on? And the next day you're like, why are we 20 minutes late? It's always a balance as a mom and as an educator. And I know there's a lot of those out in the universe, and dad educators doing the same thing, trying to get out. Everybody's trying to get where they're going, but it's just one of those times of the year where I don't know why it seems so much harder, but one step at a time, one boot at a time, one scarf, we get there one way or the other, and we make the best of the day. And it's funny, my daughters have recently adopted the phrase of my first principal: make it a great day or not, the choice is yours. So we get out of the truck and that's what they say, and it's very poignant. So everyone, make it a great day or not, the choice is yours, right?
And tomorrow's a new day. So if it wasn't great, we can try again.
Like Tom Gusky, every day is a new day for success, to try to find a new success. But What's going on in your world? What are you feeling successful with, Courtney?
I feel like my educators are hitting their stride. We're surpassed halftime now, and we're headed into those important quarters of the game. And just, students are clear with expectations. So now we're really able to dive into the learning and watch growth and acceleration happening. Part of a huge AI initiative. So it's just been really cool to see that evolve and change and now end up in the hands of our students. So it's been exciting.
Oh, it'll be cool to see trajectory over time as well.
Oh, yeah. Today, we have a very special guest joining us all the way from China. We have Kyle Wagner. He is an educator and consultant specialized in project-based learning and innovative education practice. He is the founder and lead PBL learning design coach at Transform Educational Consulting Limited, an organization dedicated to helping forward-thinking educators create socially, emotionally, and globally aware citizens through project-based experiences and student-centered environments. Wagner has over 12 years of classroom teaching experience, including roles as a humanities teacher at High Tech High and as the coordinator of Future Academy at the International School of Beijing. He holds a Master's of Educational Teacher Leadership, and he is the author of The Power of Simple, which provides simple research-based strategies for school transformation, and Where's the Teacher? The 12 Shifts for Student-Centered Environments. Welcome, Kyle.
Well, Kyle, we are so grateful to have you here on C3 Podcast and be able to showcase your expertise. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Can you start by just telling us a little bit about your background in education and just catching up our viewers a little bit about you?
Sure. Yeah, my start in education was at my old middle school, where I taught with some of my former teachers, which was a bit odd. I got to see their behavior in the lunchroom. I won't call any of them out, but no, that was great. I actually had a very good middle school experience. It was one of the very first hands-on kind of project-based schools. My middle school, when I was 12, 13 years old, was kind of revolutionary at the time, and I got around full circle, so got started there. Got a pink slip, which I don't know if people are familiar with. That's because they had budget cuts, and I was, youngest teacher, even though I was gung-ho about teaching. So I was one of the first to have to go, unfortunately, but it was opened up a good opportunity. There's a school down the street called High Tech High, And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it was featured on Most Likely to Succeed, one of the premier project-based schools in the country, and trying to do education different, where there's partnerships with the community in building these projects. And when I went over there, I was greeted by kids. They were the ones who interviewed me, which was odd. They called me by my first name, Kyle, which was also odd because I remember teacher school, they said, have them call you by Mr. whatever, especially if you're young, but get their respect. So that was interesting. And it was a very kind of student-led school. I got an opportunity to be able to lead projects. I was a history teacher there, also humanities, so English as well. We'd have students putting together living museums of like ancient historical periods where the kids would all dress up and, reconfigure the entire space. So that was fun. And then from there, got my exposure to international education by doing some summer programs, and, fell in love with the international scene. And that is what brought me out to this region of the world where I'm at now. And I've started a couple innovative programs out here, and now gone full time into consulting and doing workshops and trainings around moving from teacher-led to student-centered environments.
How wonderful that you bring the perspective of being a student in that environment to then having the opportunity to teach there. That's not something a lot of us get to experience.
Yeah, it was at the time, I remember too, this new school that they're featuring, it was at my old middle school, which was out in my small town, very, very small town. So anything made the news that was anything big, even when we had our first gas station put in. So you imagine if a new school was coming in. And I remember my brother was featured on the front page of that newspaper, and it's like, Brett Wagner tinkers at his new, in his new classroom. And it was, showing him doing something hands-on. So I still remember vividly that image when I think back to my school days.
Talk about impact.
Mm.
We're going to dive in here. Can you share some ways teachers can shift from being sage on the stage to becoming a facilitator who empowers students to take the lead in their learning?
Sure. Yeah. And I think, I think that's that notion in and of itself is hard, right? For teachers to wrap themselves around that mindset. But I think the first thing it starts with is your environment and how you set that up. Where are the kids looking most of the time, during your class period? Is it looking up to the front? Is it looking at each other? Is it, looking to a space that you've created in the room that allows them to, kind of explore and tinker and do things that are, personalized to their needs? So I think the first thing you got to start with is your environment. I would recommend most teachers to take away the front of the classroom, whatever that is, and really, not a teacher desk, take away the teacher desk. One of the first things I was asked to do when I was at High Tech High was take my big teacher desk away, which was odd to me because I thought that was just standard, but it changes the dynamics in the room, and it makes any place in the room a learning space. And the person who's doing the teaching could be anyone, right? That could be a peer, that could be a resource that you've laid out if you have stations. And I think the more that you focus on environment, the more results you're going to get. So start with your environment, group tables together, but have different kind of configurations throughout the room. I'd say get students in on the actual redesign of your environment. That's one of the big wins you can start with, asking them in terms of what their needs are, having them identify what those particular needs are. Because really it's a conversation, learning should be a continual conversation, and, the environment's going to dictate what that looks like. And then, have them share in decision-making as well. I know a lot of teachers in primary do circle time, and I know in secondary we kind of forego that because we have so much things to do, right? And so much content to cover, but it's very important, I think, to include students on decision making, whether that's as simple as, when you have deadlines for certain things or types of assessment that or ways that they're going to showcase their learning, giving them choice, leading with questions. Take your content, then look at your learning experiences as well. Are you guiding with questions? And are those student generated? Are those open-ended? Or are you guiding pretty much with content? Hey, we're going through math and here's the next chapter of the textbook. We're going through science. Okay. And now we're going to look at a couple experiments, or non-living and living things is our next unit, our topic. So, here's where we're starting. Like, gather their questions, lead with big questions, give them input in terms of what they're going to produce. And, these are all kind of shifts that I advocate for making, and that teachers have made that have seen dramatic results in terms of the dynamics in their classrooms.
I love how you start with that blank canvas of just what does the room actually look like and how can I navigate from there to get as much student empowerment into that room as humanly possible. Can you drill in even just a little more for us, Mr. Kyle? One of the central points in your book is that encouraging student independence. And we all know that every teacher is always trying to strive towards this. What strategies or tangible tips or classroom structures that can teachers put into place tomorrow or the next day or next week or jumping into next month's planning to help those kids develop that confidence that's so needed for them to guide their own learning?
Yeah. First off, I appreciate you calling Mr. Kyle. Those students at that school called me actually Kyle, which was so surprising. They said, "Welcome to High Tech High, Kyle." And I was like, "Whoa, you didn't even call me Mr. Kyle." I mean, at least put a Mr. there. It's like, whoa, this is really, am I your buddy that I just, saw last week? So yeah, with the independence, I think that's a good question because it's not something that's just going to come overnight, right? And it's not all of a sudden students are like, "Thanks, teacher, for giving me complete freedom and autonomy in my learning. Let me just like self-direct myself somewhere." And I think that's like what people assume is magically it happens. So, I usually, even through the book, I take people through, okay, let's go from structured, guided, and then kind of open, right? So this idea of, and they usually use that in terms of inquiry-based learning, right? So like, let's first put some structures in place. And, some of the good structures I tell people, like, I'm a huge advocate for project-based, more open-ended types of experiences, or at least like, hey, here's 2 or 3 lessons. We've got a bigger open-ended question that we're going to answer together. Here's some things I've scaffolded along the way. You're going to be able to share your results, whether that's experiments of some sort, whether that's looking at in history and you're looking at some kind of bigger question about who is right or who is wrong or, some kind of debate topic. But I'd say you start to foster that level of independence by getting them to think, critically, and do that, with some supports. And then you start taking those supports away. I say too, make things highly visual in your classroom in terms of progress and where kids are at. Because a lot of classrooms right now, it's like a conversation between the student and the teacher, right? But if we can make that conversation a little bit broader and say, look, everybody's at a different point in their journey. And hey, we got this unit or we got this project-based experience or we're doing these reading things or math, wherever that is. And you have some kind of progress board somewhere in the room and, have students be able to move themselves along. I was in a classroom where they're looking at creating these travel guides. And they were looking at this whole project and experience around travel. And this teacher was new to this kind of way of learning, but she put this task board up and said, here are the different tasks. Here's all the names. And students, she said, she came in the morning. She's never seen this before. Students were starting to move themselves over where they're at, and having that visual allows them to foster this kind of sense of, hey, I'm making progress, but I'm tracking that progress on my own. I'd say also too, like a lot of times, and I don't, you guys probably experience this, right? Because you're teachers, is like by the end of the day, I remember how much I hated hearing my own name. And it wasn't Mr. Kyle, it was Mr. Wagner at that time. This is right before I went to High Tech High. But like, I hear Mr. Wagner, Mr. Wagner, Mr. Wagner, Mr. Wagner. And the general question is like, I'm done. What do I do now? What's next? And you're having kids like pulling at your coattails. And I think to foster that independence is, I mentioned that task board, but also too, you create maybe a bit of a learning guide, in terms of what's coming up and what's next. And then, kids can kind of move along at their own pace. I watch these Montessori classrooms. That's why I was over in Hong Kong initially. And these kids would just choose their work at the beginning of the day. They had a folder where they'd have their work, and they would then come to the teacher when they were ready to have a conference of some sort. It wasn't like just to determine, okay, here's what I'm going to do next, teacher. It was like, okay, it was a particular learning goal that they had that they needed support with, or to conference them on their current progress. So I think make things highly visual, start with structured, where kids kind of know a pathway, but it's a little bit more open-ended. And then start moving them into more of these kind of systems where they're really kind of tracking and monitoring their own learning. And then, you as a teacher are teaching 2 or 3 kids at a time as opposed to the whole class.
Yeah, really empowering the students to know where they're starting and where they're going and have a clear picture of that so they can be participatory in their own learning and their progression.
Mm-hmm.
Inquiry is essential in a student-driven environment, but fostering it can be a challenge for many teachers. What approaches do you suggest for creating a classroom culture that encourages students to ask questions, explore, and take risks in their learning?
Yeah, and that's a great question because, inquiry runs on a spectrum. We just mentioned it, right? We said structure, guided, open. And I've seen teachers approach it with like, what questions do you have? And it's kind of hard to go from nothing and just ask students what questions they have. I mean, you have to be a bit observant in terms of like, what are they talking about? And so I think, part of things to get students inquiring more, to understand their inquiries, to start to take that step back and observe. I mean, I watched one teacher, she's teaching year one kids, and all they would talk about was space and like, exploring space. They talked about like, SpaceX and, this was kind of big and traveling to Mars. And, just by being observant of that, maybe they weren't asking questions, but they're talking about it. And that's his first start is, okay, now I know that they're interested in this topic. Now, how do I set up experiences or set up the environment that is going to foster this sense of inquiry, right? So again, look back to your environment. This particular teacher put out a lot of space stuff, had some experiments laid out in her room that had, them understanding about different concepts of space and light and travel. And, students just naturally would gravitate towards those things. And, she'd start gathering their questions that they had. So I think these provocations, whatever topic or unit that you have to teach, right? We have a curriculum to foster inquiry is like, how do you get kids in this state of curiosity towards what you have to teach, right? And so I'd say set up that kind of like wondrous environment, pay attention to what they're talking about, and then support them with just generating questions. And I wouldn't start with like, okay, you have to have an open-ended question that can't be answered, by Google or a yes, no, right? Even though that's what we're trying to get them towards, just gather all those questions that they have, try to, group those kind of questions together, see which kids, which kind of topics they're most interested in. And then you can kind of, structure things according to that. And it might be very well directed towards what you already going to teach, but now you're really starting with them. And so one of the shifts I advocate for is don't lead with content, lead with inquiry. And, I also say too, project-based experiences are great because you give kids an open-ended kind of challenge that they can address, and they're going to start inquiring. So, be cognizant of towards what they're talking about. So obviously AI is big currently right now, right? And, tons of schools are going into the whole ethics of it and what it should look like, the policies within their classrooms. And, then you got to teach maybe, okay, well, we got to teach literacy and language and that I can relate that to that topic. Well, that's something they're already interested in, and now you can start with some kind of inquiries, big questions, what should be the policy of AI in our school? I've seen classrooms take the kids on a scavenger hunt around the school and they're teaching living and non-living things. And they said, hey, what living things can we find in our school? And how do we create more green spaces for our school? The kids were hooked, right? That's a question rather than just starting with the content. So I'd say, find out what the kids are talking about, give them a particular kind of meaningful challenge to address that's related to what they're talking about. And then, kind of scaffold the approach again, where we're going from structured to guided to open, where you're kind of working on things together, addressing that, and then you kind of open things up from there.
It's that gradual release of responsibility, right? We have to build it over time and work at it to be able to sustain it and make it better over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just realize that, hey, kids, I think the fear for a lot of teachers is like, I've got to create all these things because, the kids aren't going to be able to do that, direct themselves. And I constantly go back to this example where, and I forget his name, and you might have heard of this experiment. He put a computer in a wall in India, and in this slum, these kids had never seen a computer before. And he connected to a power source that they couldn't see. And, a couple kids ventured over and he set up his experiment to observe it. And, kids figured out obviously how to turn it on, but then they're able to figure out how to access the internet. And then they started having groups of two or three that were coming over. And then they started teaching each other. They got to open a word processing document. They figured out how to type things up, and, he watches this whole thing progress. There's no teacher there. He's just set up this kind of environment that's just fostering their natural curiosity and wonder. And I think we overcomplicate learning a lot because we have so many acronyms and we have so many different learning strategies and everything, which is kind of great as educators. But let's not forget, teaching and learning is something that just happens naturally, and it usually happens because of curiosity. And how do we foster that?
So I know we have a lot of educators listening who want to dive in tomorrow and start doing this in their classroom. What are some challenges teachers might face when moving toward a student-centered model, and how can they overcome these to maintain student engagement and rigor in their classroom?
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned the word rigor. I'd love to unpack that too. For that question, what do you mean by rigor? I want to get your definition of rigor.
Way to put me on the spot. I think, having high expectations for students and what they're learning, and making sure we're not watering things down for them.
Yeah. So, look, like I mentioned, I just even mentioned that story. And it's not magical, right? It's not like tomorrow you're going to be able to just say, okay, I'm just going to create this kind of wondrous environment and it's naturally going to happen, right? Because I think we've trained students, kids through education, in a large part to kind of wait for us, to rely on us. And, they're going to be used to that kind of structure. And I've seen this happen, especially in this region of the world, in Asia, where there is an answer to a question. And if you know it, you raise your hand. If you don't know the answer to a question, you don't raise your hand. And when it comes to learning, okay, here's step A, step B, step C that we're going to have to do. And I've laid it all out for you. And here's your packet and here's your worksheets and how to get to, that particular end goal. And even with assessment and rubrics, I mean, even now where we've said it's opened up, and I've seen this in a lot of these international schools here, is they don't have very strict assessment criteria, but they say, here's your criteria for how you're going to get that top mark. And then kids just jump through hoops and they tick boxes. So I think transitioning to a student-centered environment where it's like I said, it's just led by this curiosity, this wonder and inquiry is not going to just happen the next day. But I'd say first, again, start with your environment. Like I said, take away the teacher desk, see what happens, group some tables together and, give students some various roles. Or when you do a discussion from the front of the room, right? Instead of the front of the room, put the questions on the desk and have students start to address that particular question or that particular topic, together. Set up some learning stations. I just did this with a group here in China. And I took the adults through that, set up some stations around the room. Instead of the content that you were going to teach, maybe up front, put some stations around the room and have some guided questions where students are moving through those particular stations. And you're going to start to see it might be different for them at first, but they'll pick up on it, right away. So I think you could set up your environment to allow for that. And then you can, slowly start to feel more comfortable with students taking the lead. And I think to make it rigorous is always right. It comes to assessment, but just how you're assessing them. So, take your lesson the very next day that you're going to have, take away the amount of teacher time that you're up front teaching that lesson and how you can deliver those same outcomes, but with more of a kind of collaborative environment. And then at the end, just give them a simple exit ticket or wherever that particular topic that you're teaching was, have a couple questions, have students submit their answers to that, or have students present their learning. That's a big one, right? What are students doing at the end of each of your lessons and how are they presenting or sharing that learning? And that's an easy gauge to see, okay, well, how well are they getting these concepts and how rigorous was it? Because one of the first things they will say, and I've seen this happen when you exhibit students learning, this is usually at project-based experiences. They go, Johnny over there, what did you do with Johnny? Because that's not the same Johnny that I remember. That kid had an IEP. That kid was on a specialized learning plan. I wouldn't say, I hate the word dumb down, but we also always lower the expectations, right, for that particular student, Johnny, because he couldn't fulfill the 5-paragraph essay or what it was, and that little Johnny was describing what they learned. They were supposed to talk for 3 minutes. They were 7 minutes in talking about everything that they had learned about ancient Egyptian architecture because it was something they were interested in, and the learning, they were able to share their learning and articulate their learning in a way that was meaningful to them. So these kind of shifts that I'm, talking about, I strongly suggest, go pick up a copy of the book. Sorry, I'm going to sound like a telemarketer here, but where is the teacher? Right? These shifts that I'm talking about are all in the book, and you just pick a shift. One could be creating a collaborative environment. One could be, like I talked about, Johnny, let kids share their learning rather than you giving them a paper pencil assessment. One could be inquiry, where you're leading with questions rather than content. And if you pick one of those shifts to focus on, you're going to see the classroom dynamics change for sure.
And I can attest, pick up a copy of the book and let's start small, looking at one shift that you can make in your classroom.
It's always good to have those small shifts in order to enhance practice every day. I love hearing that about starting with keeping that curiosity. I hang out with 6-year-olds quite a lot. And I mean, the wonder and delight that they can bring into a room when they care about it and it's meaningful to them. And we just always have to come back to our core. We are going to jump into our rapid fire questions. We try to do 30 seconds or less, but we're not very epic at keeping the time. So start by just telling all of our listeners, where is the best place for them to get the book and where can they follow you and learn more with you?
All right. Try to keep it on 30 seconds. Get the book, transformschool.com. /where is the teacher. Okay. Transformschool.com is also a good place to get more resources as well. There's a scorecard there. There's blog posts. There's my podcast as well. And ability to sign up for different trainings. And then LinkedIn is a great place to have a conversation. I try to post there regularly and try to, in the same way we provoke our kids, provoke conversations about kind of changing the dynamic in classrooms. So LinkedIn, look me up, Kyle Wagner, over there, or email me, kylewagner@transformschool.com.
You got them all. I think you did it all in 30 seconds or less. Fantastic.
All right. Perfect.
Yes, you're on a roll. Now tell us, Kyle, what does coaching mean to you?
What does coaching mean to you, Violet? No, I'm just kidding. That was that was my way of sharing a coaching question. No, I think it's questions, right? It's asking questions. It's listening really carefully. And I think it's supporting someone in reaching their own identified, personalized, goals. And, I will say that my biggest influence in my life has never been something I've read. It's always from a mentor, somebody who is, challenging me to see things differently and, reach something that I never saw possible. And it took a coach to do that.
Well put. And tell us, is there anything that you have not shared with us that you'd like to share with us that we missed today?
Yes. What is the real challenge here? No, sorry. That's a coaching question. I forgot to include that. Yeah. That's a coaching question that I like. What's the real challenge here? When someone has a dilemma. Is there anything again, I would share for anybody, by the way, who's trying to, as you can tell, I'm quite passionate about this. I was a teacher who wanted to quit many times. And I think everyone's been there. And just about 2 or 3 times, and who saved me was always a mentor or a coach. So, I really appreciate that you guys have this show, and I really appreciate the focus is on coaches and on coaching conversations. So I'd recommend, if you're a listener out there and you're in the trenches, reach out, get someone to kind of coach you through. I had someone come into my classroom. They helped me identify things that just completely changed dynamics. That was the whole shift model that I've introduced in the book. That's what they introduced me to. And it made a world of difference. I had joy again in the classroom, joy again with students. And, it's propelled me on this career in this place that I'm living in Asia that I would never have dreamed possible. So I'd encourage anyone, get a mentor, get a coach, and always start small. I always say every journey starts with a single step. What will your first step be?
I think he has like 5 bumper stickers already here, or t-shirts we need to be printing up. You have left us with all your wisdom. It always comes back to that power of human connection, and what we learn and we love, we remember, and we are able to hold on to moving forward. So we appreciate having you as part of our PLN, and we are so thankful for having you here today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Violet and Courtney.
Kyle gave us such great insight in how to empower students. What small shifts might you begin to make? Thanks for listening to another episode of C3. Be sure to follow us on social media. C3, connecting, coaches, cognition. Whose thinking will you mediate today?